If you think about it, it's really pretty amazing that we can use language to communicate with one another. And despite the fact that all of us went through this phase, even if English wasn't our first language in our own native languages, the full answer to how this actually happens is unknown. But today we're going to be focusing on one small segment of language learning, the learning of English past tense verbs. So if you're listening to this video and hearing these words that I'm saying to you and you can understand them, then you've learned English as a language. And despite the fact that all of us has gone through this process, that doesn't really give us any more insight as to how it actually happens. But one thing we do know is that there's a timeline as far as how you learn language from when you're born to when you're about 5 or 6 years old. And we're going to go through that timeline right here. So I'll just go ahead and draw a timeline here on the right side of the page, and I'll divide it up into a couple of different years. We'll say this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 years old, and there's a little bit of a gap right here, and we'll say down here is when you're an adult. So right up here at the top, I'll put a big star because that's when we come onto the scene. That's our birthday, that's when we're born. And there's a couple of different phases that we go through on the way towards fluency, which we'll achieve down here in the adult phase. So between about 8 to 12 months, which I'll do here in this blue color, this is when babies start to babble. And so you might hear them saying repetitive two-syllable sounds like da-da, or ba-ba, or bb, or something like this. The infant's just kind of playing around with the sounds that they're learning how to make. Between the ages of 18 and 24 months, which I'll do in this green color, this is when infants typically gain the ability to say two-word phrases. So you might hear something like want milk, or daddy go, or hi mom, or something like that. Not too complicated, but you can get an idea of what the infant is saying. The next step down from that occurs when the infant is between, we'll say, 2 and 3 years old. And this is the time of your life when you go through what's called a language explosion, where you learn tons and tons of words and your vocabulary increases exponentially every single day. And during this phase, infants can typically say 3 words. So you might hear them say something like, me go store, which we know isn't grammatically correct, but you can kind of get an idea of what the infant is saying. And there's no tenses, you don't know if this is in the past or the present, or if this person is going to the store, or they want to go to the store, or there's really a lot of ambiguity here, but the point is that the infant is gaining a mastery over the language and has advanced from the 2-word stage to the 3-word phase. So once they get through this, anywhere between the time they're 3 and 4 years old, they learn to say complete sentences. And again, these sentences aren't completely grammatically correct. The child hasn't reached fluency, but they're pretty good, and you can pretty much have a conversation with these children. And I'll show here in purple, once they're about 4 to 5 years old, I'll just draw this as a down arrow towards adulthood, this is where you really get fluency. And even though your vocabulary continues to grow even into your adult years, a child is generally fluent by the time they're 5 to 6 years old. Now, a couple things just to note about this timeline is that it's variable. Not every single person is going to go through this exact progression, and they'll still figure out how to speak their language perfectly well. Another thing is that it's a continuum. It's not as if you suddenly reach your 2nd birthday and you start saying 3-word phrases. It's more of a progression, and you can gradually go from one stage to the next, and there's really no clear boundaries. But our focus today is going to be on these English past tense verbs and how children learn them from the time they're born to the time they gain fluency in English. And there's 2 main classes of English past tense verbs, and the first of these is the so-called regular verbs. And when you form these, it's by a pretty general rule. You just add the letters D or ED to the end of the word. So you could have something like watch, which as you add the ending just becomes watched. Or you could have something like try, which gets the ending ED and becomes tried. And even though the letters change, the sounds stay the same. So this is pretty easy to form, and this works for pretty much all of the verbs in English, with a couple of exceptions. And those belong to the second category, the irregular verbs. And like we said, these are formed not by any general rule, but seemingly at random. So you get things like the verb fly, for example, which in the past tense becomes flew, which is a little weird, only one sound changes. You can have a little stranger, the verb catch, which becomes caught, which is a little bit bizarre when you think about it. And then you can get things that are really off the wall, like the verb go, which becomes went in the past tense, which keeps none of the same sounds and none of the same letters, which will leave anyone who's learning this English language to think to themselves, what is going on? So it's clear that infants face some challenges when they're learning English, but how do they exactly go to learn these past tense verbs? It turns out that they go through a couple of phases, and we're going to mark them on this chart right here that we'll build. And we'll just put our x and y axes down, and we'll label them. On the x-axis is going to be time, and it'll start from 0 and go out to the right. And on the y-axis here, we'll mark percent correct in terms of how often they say the verb, how many times do they get the past tense form correct. And when you graph this, you get a really interesting shape. It turns into something that looks just like this. And since it looks like a U, we call this progression U-shaped learning. And they go through 3 phases: Phase A, Phase B, and Phase C. So what's the explanation behind each of these phases? Well, in Phase A, children are really just memorizing the verb forms. So if they hear the verb I went, they tend to say that correctly with no problems. And that goes for all of the verbs that they tend to use. In the second phase, Phase B, they begin to have a lot more problems when they're forming these verbs, which is why the percent correct goes down. And this is where you might hear a child say something like, I goed, or I flied, because they learn this ed rule and then they over-apply it to the verbs that don't actually get it when you're forming it in the past tense. And because they're adding this regular rule to these irregular verbs, this process gets a special name. It's called over-regularization. So we'll just put down over-regularize for stage B. And then for stage C, they learn that there's a rule, but they also know that there are exceptions, so they begin to get them more and more right as they get older and have more and more experience with the language. So for this one, for letter C, we can say they have this rule, the ed rule, but they also know the exceptions, which is why they say I went or I flew correctly. Now this all sounds really great, these 3 steps that children go through to achieving fluency in past tense English verbs, but in reality it's a little more complicated. So we're going to focus on this part B, which I'll denote with a star right here. So you might find it interesting how infants learn to use verbs that they might not hear very often. Verbs like bring or catch, which you and I take for granted, but we really don't say that often. So how can an infant learn to say them correctly if they don't hear them said by an adult? And it turns out that we have to introduce a new concept, and that's this concept of past tense rules, or how you form verbs based on simple rules of grammar. So you can group verbs together. So we'll take one group, which will group the verbs buy, bring, and catch. And you might think to yourself, why are you grouping these verbs together? But it has to do with how you form them when you form the past tense. And to do that, you just add the ending ought. So this becomes bought, it becomes brought, and catch becomes caught. So if the child hears buy becomes bought, they get for free changing bring to brought and catch to caught. So the child doesn't actually have to hear the verb caught being used to learn how to say it, since they know this rule is present between this group of verbs. It works the same for another group of verbs, which we'll demonstrate here at the bottom. So I'll say verbs like sit, begin, and ring. And you and I know how to say these verbs because we're fluent speakers of English, but to an infant who hardly ever hears the word ring, how are they learning to say it correctly? And that's because that all these verbs belong to the same group, in which they change their I to an A. So sit becomes sat, begin becomes began, and ring becomes rang. And again, if the child just hears one of these enough times to learn the rule, they get the rest for free, without having to hear each individual word formed into the past tense each time. And this makes sense, right? If you have a rule that turns these verbs into their past tense, you don't have to hear every single verb in the past tense to learn it, which would take tons of time. And in that case, the infant wouldn't learn how to say verbs that they've never heard before. So it saves time and allows the infant to reach fluency that much faster. So we can make a little addition to our chart here, which we'll do in orange, and that's the addition of these rules. So we'll label this as, I'll just say, PT rules, for past tense rules. And that occurs as they're going from stage B, or accelerating from stage B into stage C, which explains why their percent correct really begins to increase once they pass this over-regularizing phase. So you might be thinking to yourself, why is this important to learn how infants learn language? And the first answer is really just that it's interesting. It's something that we all go through, so we can all share that common experience, but we really don't have a full answer, and so it's interesting just to get some kind of insight into that process. The other thing is that it might help the learning of other languages. So it remains to be seen whether or not these findings in English can be applied to other languages. But if they are applicable, perhaps this is a new way to teach languages, by teaching rules as opposed to memorizing tables and tables of verbs.